welcome to tonight's event at Onward Think Tank. It's brilliant to see so many of you here today to talk about a really important topic that is actually quite often discussed in Westminster, but rarely does it look at the topic of the recent report that we launched, which is about hidden benefits, all of the additional benefits that people get in addition to universal credit or other of their very regular benefits that they usually get. And I'm delighted to be joined by such a fantastic panel here this evening. Before I introduce everyone, a very quick bit of housekeeping. You may have noticed on your way in that the nearest facilities to us are out of order. So if you do need to use the facilities during the event, please go back to reception. And just on your left as you come out, there's an accessible toilet there. Please use that one instead. So I will start by introducing the Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions on my right.
Thank you.
And then we have Fraser Nelson from The Times, and also Lana Hepsall, who wears many different hats, but in particular has recently set up something called the Welfare Information Network. But I will start by turning to you, Helen, for some opening remarks.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Fabulous to be here, Caroline, and thank you for kicking this event, hosting this event, and for your work on the Passported Benefits paper, which was a really good read and really important. And I say particularly important in the light of, just to give people in the room a quick sort of flavour of why this sort of thoughtful, hard, deep work is so important. My last few days have involved trying to get the government to do a U-turn on pensions mandation, i.e. deciding and being able to dictate how people how people's pension savings are invested, which is currently going on in the House of Lords at the moment. Yesterday, it's spending time in Wales visiting JCB and a charity supporting young people into work. Today, holding the government to account on their latest announcement on welfare reform, which is costing another £1 billion. And all over this period, dealing with a meningitis outbreak in my constituency. So there's a lot that goes on, and what is incredibly helpful, therefore, is to have work by think tanks like Caroline's done in Onward, where actually they get really into some quite complex policy areas, so that then people like me can look at that and go, okay, what of that sort of stuff can we use to come forwards with our programme for welfare reform? I mean, it's a bit like we announced last summer substantial welfare savings and also into conference, which included some big policy changes to do with sickness benefits for common mental health problems and lower level neurodiversity. And in that work, hope you don't mind, we worked with CSJ on that, but they did some of the heavy lifting on the detail of that work. So fantastic, as I say, to have Onward doing this work. Reflecting a bit more on the specific work on passported benefits. Well, I come at my brief with a view that fundamentally we need to make sure that work pays, and that it always makes sense for somebody who can work to be in work. That is not a new approach for a Conservative. In fact, in Duncan Smith's big welfare reform, the introduction of universal credit was all about that. It was all about making sure that work pays, and to the extent that people get into work and earn more money, yes, that their benefits will come down, but come down only at a gradual rate, so that it really does continue to make sense for people to do more work. That made great progress in the sort of 2010s, but we'll all know that the benefits bill has been going up steeply, started going up coming through and out of the pandemic under us, and then going up at a steeper rate under the current government. So something's gone very, very wrong. On the one side, something that's gone very wrong is sickness benefits, and it being too easy really to get personal independence payments for people who could and should be working. Yes, you can work while you claim PIP, but many people are worried about working if they do. And I say that while at the same time you've got people who should be receiving that kind of sickness benefit and find it incredibly hard to get through the process. So it's like that the process isn't working for many reasons, not least that they're not doing face-to-face assessments. So that's one big area where in practice it's not making sense for people to work, because their income can be more generous or more reliable from benefits. And then coming to this point in the passported benefits paper, what that paper sets out is a spend of around £10 billion on a whole series of benefits, which is significant. Now, when you look at each of those benefits, you can see how, as you go through each one, you can imagine how the argument is made for this and the political difficulty of trying to reform that benefit. But then if you look at the overall picture, well, hold on, this isn't being properly considered in the way our welfare system is working. And also, there are a bunch of cliff edges that are not being looked at sort of day to day. So extra sort of points in the welfare system, where if somebody goes into work or increases their income, they're going to increases their income through work. They're going to have a significant loss of either financial support or support in kind that is pretty material. So though I felt, overall, it's not a territory of easy answers, but it is a really, really important question to be asking, and I think very important to have set out, as you did, all these extra areas where people are getting benefits and state support, so that as part of the bigger conversation that we need to have as a country, that I feel the government is completely dodging and unable to have any hard conversations, but we as a country have to have a hard conversation about how are we going to get the benefits bill down to a level that we can afford, and how are we going to make sure that work does pay.
Brilliant. Lana, I'll come to you next.
Yeah. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for including me on this illustrious panel. It's a real privilege to be here at Onward. I'm going to echo a lot of what Helen has said already, because this country has a hidden welfare system. It's a system that doesn't catch the newspaper headlines, doesn't get the mentions in Parliament. However, it steers the choices of millions of people in this country. And it racks up a bill of £10 billion in the making. And that £10 billion, it pays for all of those additional extras that sit behind universal credit. And those extra payments, each, as Helen has said, in their own merit, you can see why they should be in place. You can see why it's important that they're there. But collectively, they have a really detrimental impact on people who are trying to get into work. The spend on work and pensions is set to rise to 400 billion by the end of the decade. So you can say, 10 billion isn't that much. But that 10 billion has a disproportionately adverse impact on people who day to day have to make real choices about their finances and what goes in and what stays out. And these additional benefits are not helping. So what are these benefits? They're things like paid for prescriptions, free school meals. They're things like council tax reduction. So you can see why they would be important. Put them all together, and you set people who are going for low income or entry-level jobs, you set them against a decision where earning more not only costs them their universal credit, it costs them the entitlement to these additional benefits, which can either go away in one fell swoop or be taken away over a period of time. Now, I see welfare through the prism of my own disability. I was registered blind in my teens, and the moment that happened, people around me made decisions about what my limits are. They decided what path would be difficult to take. They decided which ambitions of mine were a bit over-optimistic. And that experience has stayed with me to this day. What I've learned about welfare is that unintentionally, the systems that are there to support people actually constraining people to what they cannot do constrains their life expectancy and what they can achieve. And instead of supporting them into being their best selves and getting what they can out of life, out of jobs, out of their prospects, it narrows them down to what assumptions are made about their capabilities. And it gets worse, because not only is there a state system in place with the hidden benefits, the private sector's ploughed in as well. You have a whole raft of rail cards, access cards, disability cards, all of those unquantifiable amounts of money that are people can access in addition to their benefits already. Discounts on food, drinks, cinemas, events, gym memberships, broadband, water bills, all of this adds up to a financial cliff edge that, as Helen has said, when somebody is faced with getting into work or not, it becomes completely unrealistic for a family that is already struggling to enter the world of work because work doesn't pay. And what do you do about this system? Any kickback, any pushback, any attempt to narrow that eligibility gets such adverse pushback, we all find out about it. The Merlin Group, just recently, they decided that they were going to narrow the eligibility for their theme park visitor passes for disabled people. What happened? The pushback was so violent and so aggressive that within weeks they reversed that decision. And what does that amount to? It's not just the financial. When you're a disabled person in particular, when the state steps in and takes away responsibility for you paying for the basics, the council tax, when you can expect the government to step in and pay for what you consider to be bare essentials, what happens next? Whenever there's a drama, whenever there's a wobble, what do? You step back and you ask the government to step in and take away all of your problems. And that has, in Britain, created a two-tier system where there is an expectation that people who have a disability, and let's put it this way, on sickness benefit alone, there's 1 in 4 people in this country already qualify for some sort of concession. That is completely unsustainable. So when you're asking the government to step in and pay for all of that, you're getting nowhere. The bill keeps rising up and up and up. And just last week, I came across a report that actually made me catch my breath. The OBR has estimated that in this financial year, we will raise 329 billion through income tax. And we're going to spend 333 billion on welfare alone. It's obvious that the welfare system in this country needs to change today because we can't afford this anymore.
Fraser.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, you guys, for coming along this evening. I think this is easily the most important subject in British public life, and it is as bad as it is because there have been too few events like this over the last sort of 10, 15 years. One of the things that drew me into journalism was listening to, I don't know if any of the rest of you can remember, Rabbi Lionel Blue, who used to give Thought for the Day on Radio 4. And I loved it, this rabbinical wisdom, these little turns of phrase which he had that would really make you think. It's so much better than the nonsense we've got now for Thought for the Day. But anyway, on a second note, he had this, this phrase where he was talking, one of his spiels was about what he called moral long-sightedness, the ability to see problems on the other side of the world or worry about problems 100 years in the future while not being able to see the problems under our own doorstep. And that kind of stayed with me because, what is most of the news about? It's about what's happening in Iran, what's happening in America. These are vivid, compelling stories. And yet what's happening in our own doorstep, in our own communities, a few streets away from us, is not so compelling. We're very good at ignoring it. George Orwell once wrote that to see what's in front of your nose is a huge struggle. And that is incredibly true. So much of journalism is about trying to see what's in front of our noses, about trying to find a way of interesting people in what's basically happening to each other, trying to overcome the social distance between us. Because what has happened over the years is that there has been such a chasm between the lives that we occupy in Westminster or various activities and the life occupied by the millions of people who are on benefits. And that's why I think this report is so important. It does, as it says here, paternalism has triumphed over aspiration, but it also describes how, the way that these passported cliff edges stack up, and if you take work, then you're significantly worse off as a result. Now, this means something really quite fundamental. That what we regard as the economy, what almost all of us in this room regard as the economy, is something quite simple that we've taken for granted all of our lives. That if we do well at school, we might get into a good uni. If we do get a good degree, you might get a good job. Get a good job, you might be able to buy a house. There's a kind of something else I used to play as a kid, this game of life it was called. It's like a board game where, it's like, it kind of gamifies what we all know as being basic life. There are things you can mistake, sort of snakes and ladders, there are things you can do, but you can pretty much zigzag your way to the top. But this ecosystem has been steadily destroyed for those at the bottom of the earnings pile. There's not much they can really do to get ahead. The bottom rungs of a ladder have been sawn off by a welfare state that was designed to help them. And that's what this report highlights today. Now, the kind of the basic aspects of this is, there ought to be a return on your effort. It's something which almost doesn't need to be codified because we all take it for granted. We're all lucky enough to work in worlds where pretty much there is a return. We know that we work really hard. There's a reasonable chance of getting promoted, a reasonable chance of moving on in life. Now, that is something, not for sure. Life's full of unfairness, but broadly speaking, that's the ecosystem we take part in. And that's what's been destroyed for something like the bottom 25% of this country. Now, I spent some time in Blackpool earlier on, which is now pretty much overtaking Glasgow as being the epicenter of the new modern poverty. I met some kids there who hadn't got a single GCSE, and that wasn't surprising because almost 40% of children in Blackpool are in that category. 40%. I looked it up, and it was at the worst extreme of Britain. And on the other extreme was where I live, Richmond upon Thames, where that's true for about 5%. But the kids I spoke to were not dim kids. They just looked around them and couldn't see the point, really, of getting those exams. They couldn't see the point of getting GCSEs, let alone A-levels, let alone a university degree, because those they saw around them were not visibly doing better by their efforts. All of us look around and see who's doing well, who we want to emulate. All of us look around and try to work out what is the game of life. Where am I on this board game? What has been put in front of me? And not many people in Blackpool can see any real way of working the way out of a situation, of getting to where they'd like to be. The military's still there. The military is what my dad joined. He took him from leaving school at 15 to the kind of life where the road for me was pretty, clear of these obstacles. I had the ladder. That ladder was the most precious thing in the world to me, but that ladder is not available to those who leave school at 15 in this country. Not anymore. They think the new game of life is to get ahead when you get a diagnosis. This starts early. Special needs, extra time in exams. And you can quite easily get more than the minimum wage. You do that if you get on straightforward incapacity benefits with standard PIP. Now, you can, of course, decide to work, but then why would you? I don't mean this in a morally judgmental way, and this is the problem. When you talk about this, it can sound like you're blaming people for being lazy, blaming them for being scroungers. That's why I wanted to make a documentary of this for Channel 4, to see this system through the prism of the eyes of those trapped inside it. And what I wanted, I didn't say this in the film, but I wanted the viewer to do is to think, if I was that single mother, if I was getting the equivalent of 35, 37 grand in benefits, would I swap that security for the insecurity of hard graft on the minimum wage? It's not just that the work was incredibly difficult. We're talking stacking shelves, thanklessly, some of the toughest work there is in this country. But it's the insecurity. If you're a parent, you owe it to your kid to provide her. The single mother I met for my documentary was trying to give her child this kind of security she never had growing up. And you can't blame them at all. It's a system that's to blame. Every single person I spoke to was desperate to break out of it, but they were trapped. Because as far as they could work out, if they tried to break out, they'd be out of the system, they'd be right out of this kind of Kafkaesque maze that they had somehow managed to navigate in the first place. And they did not see a ladder. They did not see an opportunity. And the other thing, by the way, is that the nature of work has changed. Terry Leahy famously used to stack shelves at Tesco before he became his chief executive, but right now, supermarkets subcontract this work to outside agencies. If you work for one of these cleaning agencies, you're not at the bottom rung of the ladder, you're in a completely different ecosystem. So I do think that the nature of work has changed this as well. There has been a kind of a lack of economic cohesion, a lack of social cohesion, but above it all, a lack of caring, a lack of looking at what's happening to people, a lack of trying to see the world through their eyes, a simple failure to ask what game of life we're asking those at the bottom to play. Now, I do think that the Labour government is talking the language of reform. Liz Kendall gave some great speeches when she was attacking Helen and her colleagues for the scandal of, and by the way, they deserved it all. Can I just say here, I'm not saying they deserve it. Those reforms were great, but then COVID came along and they just lost the ball. So the number of sickness benefit, people being signed on to sickness benefit went from something like 500 a day to 2,000 a day. Imagine that. Imagine of us that are here in this room. Imagine what 2,000 would look like. Imagine that every single day being signed on to sickness benefits from which you're unlikely to emerge. Now, they deserved the criticism they were getting. But since then, the number, I couldn't believe it when I looked up the figure, 7,000 a day. This has gone out of control. I don't believe the government is in control of this anymore. Now, partly because Mel Stride tried to reform it, they were sued, it was struck down by the courts. We're in a system where ministers can see it. The ministers, Pat McFadden is a good man, Liz Kendall is a good woman. These are not people who don't care about the poor. They don't care about the system. They can see the damage it's inflicting on communities and societies. They want to change it. But they think if they do, they can be sued. They can be judicial reviewed. They can get their emails brought up in court. They can be in court for 9 months. So there is a crisis of state capacity, if you like, a crisis of government ability to act. But here's the thing. If there's not enough pressure, why would they act? This is the thing. So even being here in this room discussing it demonstrates an interest. Hopefully interest will translate to pressure, and pressure will translate into a mandate. Now, I also did it somewhere when I was looking at this. Imagine if the sickness benefit numbers are stuck at where they were pre-COVID, 1.8 million. And imagine we hadn't lost 1 million people to sickness benefit. Imagine they'd still be in the economy. What would Britain look like now? The answer? Highest growth in the G7. We'd have more than enough money to meet all of our defence commitments and have money left over from for tax cuts as well. So if we do discard the abilities, the talents of literally millions of our countrymen, we can't expect an economy to function. Of course not. Immigration can cover it up. It can cover up. It can stop us from facing the consequences of what we're doing. But we're never, if the engines aren't all going, then of course we're not going to go forward with the speed that we should do. We're not going to achieve social cohesion. We're never going to be able to afford proper defence. And the funny thing about benefits is, yes, all the figures in this report are true. There are billions of pounds being wasted. But what nobody's begun to calculate is the other side of this equation, how much we're missing by not having these people who could be working in work, how much they could be contributing for their families, for their communities, for the taxpayer, sure, for the exchequer, but that's the least of the problem here. So I really do believe, though, that people can turn the corner on this. If there's enough people caring about it, if we start to see this through the prism, not of wasted money, but God knows there's enough of that, but wasted lives, of wasted human capital. That's fundamentally what's happening here. There are too many people who are not being used to anything like their abilities because they're responding to incentives like everybody else. You play the cards you're dealt. And the cards they're being dealt, the road that's being laid in front of them, leads to the benefit queue. And if they want to diverge from that road, if they want to go and take this flinty, steeper path towards work, then good luck to them. They're on their own. Now, that is a system crying out for reform. I think pretty much everybody believes it needs reform, but it's happening at glacial speed. And that is something which, with enough interest, with enough pressure, can be changed.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Fraser, and thank all of you for your introductions. I thought it might be helpful just at the start to explain a little bit about why I undertook this research and the background behind it. For those who don't know me well, before I joined Onward, I was a special advisor in the Department for Work and Pensions and a number of other departments. And I think this research was really born out of frustration more than passion, looking at just how slow the rollout of universal credit had been. It was meant to be completed by the end of 2017, and lo and behold, we're almost a decade later, and the rollout is still not complete. And that is a big reason why we have just so many of these extra schemes that are added onto your regular payments or sit outside it, that add up to such a large amount, because simply reform is so complex. If you have to try and work out how to give people additional income in universal credit and all of the old legacy benefits like job seeker allowance, employment and support allowance, all of the rest of them. And that is one of the reasons why we've got such a problem with this today. And so what I wanted to do was try and add up just how many different schemes there are that people who are on universal credit can now draw down money from. And I thought perhaps I could count maybe 10 on just from my own knowledge. By the end of the project, I had got to over 20 different schemes which people on universal credit could get additional income from. And yes, some other people could get that money as well. People on personal independence payment were sometimes eligible too, or there were very complex income thresholds that people who weren't on benefits could apply to. But what did this do to people, which has already been alluded to, particularly by you, Lana? What does this do to people's personal agency? And why is that such an important part of the question when you're looking at whether this money could be better spent elsewhere? It makes it so complicated for people to even just work out what their household budget is if they go to one scheme for their free school meals, one scheme for their healthy food and vitamins, another scheme for their holiday activities and food program, another scheme for additional childcare, another scheme for their energy bills, for their water bills, for almost every part of your regular household budget. If you are on benefit, you can have that cost in some way mitigated, and not in a uniform income transfer to you, but by applying here and there, by getting benefits in kind. Yes, sometimes getting cash, sometimes getting bizarre top-up cards that the government puts money on each week that is separate from your benefit payment. So that's really why I undertook this research, and why I really wanted to be the first think tank to try and add up what is the cost of all of this, and could it be better spent elsewhere. And that's really why in the recommendations of the report, I really quite radical, looking at how you could roll in some of these benefits into your regular universal credit payments so that people can make the same budgeting decisions. As Fraser has talked about, we want people who are on benefits to face the same daily budgeting choices as everybody else, so that they have that smooth path if they are going into work, looking at taking on more hours or getting a promotion, that they aren't suddenly facing those cliff edges. And if you roll things into universal credit, then it can be tapered away in a much smoother way. So that's really why I entered into this research, and why I'm really pleased to have people here today to talk about it. So I thought I'd open up the discussion using Chair's prerogative by looking at a few different aspects that I came across during the research. And the first is really looking at how the state has become really paternalistic in its way of tackling poverty, and how the benefit system, with all of these extra schemes, has proliferated into almost every government department, almost every domestic government department in the country. And so, Helen, I wanted to come to you first to really talk about, how do you think we've got to this point where the welfare state has splintered into so many different parts of government? And what would you do, particularly looking at things like the personal independence payment statistics out today showing a huge rise again? What do you think that the state of play tells us about the likelihood of Labour doing anything about it?
On the latter of those points, I mean, everything I see is Labour less and less likely to do anything about it, because we saw last year their attempt to make welfare savings that ended up in them spending an extra 300 million. We have seen them end up, they originally said they weren't going to lift the two-child benefit cap, but then Keir Starmer needed to survive, so he said that he would lift the two-child benefit cap, which is clearly spending another £3 billion. And then yesterday, Pat McFadden announced welfare reform, but it's spending an extra £1 billion. So when are the hard choices going to come? I mean, a bit of your thought about how did we get here, which I think about. I mean, one of the things is in some respects it feels like it's a product of compassion, where people see a situation, they think, oh, we want to help, and then there's the pot of money that the Treasury has from taxes, and it's, well, let's use some of that money to help some people, and little by little the consequence of that compassion is overall a system that adds up actually to trapping people. Whether, I mean, I thought, Fraser, your phrase about the bottom rungs of the ladder just not being there, because it's just not worth making those early steps that could then get you to make the next step and the next step. And it's I think so often the accidental result of what was in their own right a series of compassionate decisions of people trying to help, but having the unintended consequences. So such a classic thing that happens through government's decisions. And I think one consequence of those compassions is to pick up on a point I think Lana made, and it's something I think about quite a lot, is about taking away people's agency. And it's fundamentally a very bad thing to do. By so much of the help people get has strings attached, and you reduce their choices, and you reduce actually in practice their ability to get themselves into a better situation by always telling people and almost turning people into victims by telling them the state is the answer to their problem, unintendedly through compassion. I think that's why we have to do the hard work of making the argument that actually supporting people to be able to take responsibility for themselves and their family, and setting up a system that actually enables that rather than essentially disenabling that has to be the right way to go.
Yeah, and actually just to pick up on that, Lana, I know that you spoke about in your opener as well a lot about that personal agency point and how important that is. And I know that you've written also about how this conveyor belt really starts at school, that dependency, that conveyor belt of dependency, particularly on disability benefits, starts at a really young age. And once you're on the hook there, you're then very unlikely to come off it later in life. Do you want to explain a little bit more about what you've uncovered and what you've been writing about in terms of those claims starting really early on?
Well, I talked about the two-tier system, didn't I? Where there's a positive expectation of actually being able to do better at Fraser's game of life if you have that badge, right? If you have as a child an EHCP, if you qualify for these benefits, if you have DLA, then all of a sudden the issues of transport to school, the responsibility for your child doing better at school, them getting more intervention, because schools are difficult environments these days. It's big classrooms, teachers are dealing with a lot. So if you can, as a parent, ensure that your child is getting that little bit more attention, that their path is smoothed a bit further, you would. It's not. If you don't play the system, I won't tell you what's the word for it. I mean, you'd be crazy not to. You'd be crazy not to, because you're not ensuring that your child is getting the absolute best. But what happens when you leave school? It's like all of a sudden those additional expectations don't translate into the jobs market. And with the jobs market the way it is, the number of vacancies has dropped so profoundly and so dramatically that my daughter applied for a job in a pub, as you do as a youngster. For 10 jobs, they had 250 applicants. They were doing the interviews in batches of 10 to make sure that every youngster that applied for a job had a fair hearing, because they are, they understand what it's like, and they knew that the vast majority of them would be turned away. So what we do early on doesn't translate into the opportunities and the concessions that we're able to tap into as adults. And I remember so vividly when I lost my sight, and actually back in the day, the support I got was scant. It was mostly just go away and pretend you're not here. It's different now, and I had to fight for every single opportunity that I wanted to have, because I was defined by what people presumed I couldn't do. And that's what happens, as Caroline said, it's like that's what happens at an early age. If you buy into the gamification of being able to get ahead early, you're trapping yourself. You are trapping yourself and your child in a situation where it does become, inescapable. The bottom rungs of the ladder are sawn off, and there's no way out. And that's where I really hope, Helen's been so thoughtful about this is actually that there are systems and ways to ensure that that imbalance is addressed, and the measures that we put in early to support people to get a good education don't become a hindrance later on.
And Fraser, I was really struck both by your documentary and by some of your Substacks, in particular one where you describe a welfare Narnia, where we sort of dish out huge sums of money with frightening little interest in then following up what outcomes are being created as a result of all of that money. And that was something that really was stuck in my mind very vividly when I was writing the report. And I think one of the common themes from your documentary about all of the different people who you went around to spoke to, how that fear of losing everything was so embedded, when actually often it wasn't true that they would automatically lose out on support, but the perception had been built up that the safety net would suddenly be pulled away if they even tried working. Do you want to explain a little bit more about what
Yeah,
you
I think
found?
this is really important. I mean, I guess your first question was how did we end up in this situation? And I think like part of it is the professionalization of politics. So you end up with an administrative class which see the country through the bars of a spreadsheet rather than having lived experience of it. I mean, William Beveridge wrote the original welfare report. For a while lived in Toynbee Hall in the east end of London. The idea there is to actually go and live amongst the poor and to understand what their lives were like. Only that can give you an understanding of it. So you end up by thinking, okay, how do we define equality? Why don't we take money from this guy and give it to that guy? That will flatter our Gini coefficients of the income distribution, So you end up with these relatively kind of weird the decile distribution tests. How does this policy affect the lowest 10%, the next lowest 10%? It's become a standard governmental test that the Blair guys introduced. Now you can see why he wanted to do that, because that is a way of seeing fairness. But what wasn't being looked at was what this does to the incentives. So if in doing this, you're actually destroying the work incentive, you're robbing work of its economic function, you're robbing them of the basic incentive that any human being needs to go and try to better their lives, that was invisible, because we were only ever looking at this through the prism of income redistribution, decile distribution, etc. It was only one lens. Now, I was in Washington recently talking to the guys at the American Enterprise Institute who are coming up with this notion of social capital. We haven't really developed it in the UK, but if you go into work, you've got contacts, you've got friends, you've got family. Your social capital is quite big. If you then go into unemployment, your world shrinks. You don't really hear about jobs being available because so many of them come from informal networks. Your support network is smaller. You are poorer in a meaningful way. Now, the Americans quantify this by looking at the notion of social capital. We don't in this country, and I think that we should. But the other, so to come back to the question you asked me just then, is that we can also think, actually the system's okay because we've changed it now, so even if you're on benefits and you do extra work, you can keep the money. Now, that might be technically true, but the only thing that matters is what they believe to be true. Now, we have created such a Kafkaesque nightmare of a system that when I was doing my documentary, we needed a team of lawyers. It would take us sometimes a day or 2 days when we came across a case study, because in television, you have to make sure everything's absolutely watertight. It would take us 2 days to work out the complexity of these individual people's situation, to find out, she says this, is she telling the truth? Not so much that, but has she got it wrong? But if it took professionals that day, how on earth do we expect people to navigate it who are in the middle of the system? What matters is what they believe. Now, I met somebody else recently. This wasn't when doing my documentary. One of the reasons I put across it is a receptionist who I know quite well. And I found out that she wasn't taking any extra work because she believed that if she did, she would lose everything. And this was somebody who was not in a good financial way. But she believed if she took extra work, extra shifts, it will all go down via the universal bath hole, the credit bath hole, and there'd be nothing work. Now, I wanted to try and help her out, so I did. I got an accountant, I know. That accountant took 2 days for her situation to work out that actually she was incorrect. She could have got money, it would have helped her. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what these guys feel, what they believe. That's what matters. And we have made this situation so complicated. All these overlapping benefits, all the ESA, the LCWRA, the US brackets, the DLA, the PIP, this complete alphabet soup that we've dropped people into. And of course, if it's become unnavigable, but it doesn't matter how technically we might improve it. What matters is how they see it. But we have lost the ability to see it as they see it. And that's why we're in the state we're in.
Brilliant. Right, I will now open up to questions from the floor. And for the benefit of the live stream, I will try to abbreviate the question and repeat it just so that the microphones pick it up too. So who wants to kick off? Hands up. Right, well, I'll take them in threes. I'll go to the lady in white here, then lady in white here, and then the gentleman on the front row. So just speak loudly.
I'm Natasha, and I was diagnosed with a psychological disorder in 2018. I was 22, and I received a letter saying, like, you're severely disabled, that's it, you don't have to work forever. And I personally refused to believe that and wanted to actually do something with my life. I'm actually in my third year of law now. But I do think that when we have politicians and journalists who come out and, talk about the reform, people get very sensitive because they're like, no, I need it, it's my mind. So I think that there needs to be things in place that we have BAME initiatives, like when I'm applying for jobs, that's like right at the bottom, they prioritize it. And I think there needs to be something similar for people with disabilities to be encouraged to actually want to do something, because I've seen on X politicians talking about, we're going to get them to clean up graffiti, and it's almost like they're criminal, like punishing people who claim to be sick, and we can't prove it because it's an invisible illness, right? So I do think there needs to be more initiatives in place to kind of encourage people, whether it's banks or law firms or creative industries or politics itself, that people can get involved with disabilities. That's
Brilliant. All right, lady over here.
Thank you. My name is Caroline as well, Caroline. And thank you all very much for a really interesting description of the problem and a diagnosis of how we got to where we got. But what I'd be really interested to know is how we start to tackle this. When Helen, you will take your station when Lana is your minister after the next general election, what do we do to get ourselves into a situation where we are helping people back into work? And particularly, Lana made some really interesting and moving points about particularly people with disability. How do we even start?
Brilliant. And gentleman on the front row here.
Well, I was going to ask something a little bit similar, actually. This sort of baroque state that's being described, it appears to have an incentive system of its own, from what I'm hearing, from this very informative panel. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, how do you change the incentive system? At the top, what are these turning points, like the Merlin U-turning after this policy you're describing? It's not just a governmental thing. Why is it that people making decisions in this field are so vulnerable themselves? Not in the same way that obviously those with benefits are vulnerable, but why is it that it's a bit of an edgy situation?
Brilliant. All right, so just to recap quickly, first question was about initiatives to help people with disabilities, and then we've had two similar ones there about fixing the issue, what can we do to tackle some of the issues, and then the third question was about incentives and why is it so difficult. Before I turn to the panel, I might just take the last one first a bit. Why is it so difficult? I think part of it is a function of how departments negotiate with the Treasury in order to spend money, in that it's far easier to ask the Treasury to approve spending for something that only costs, say, 50 million, 100 million even, sometimes even just shy of £1 billion, than it is to put forward proposals that make very large sweeping changes that require primary legislation in order to change systems like universal credit. And part of it is a function of the rollout not being complete yet, that every single change to the benefit system that we make, we have to work out how to do it in universal credit and do it in legacy benefits. So I think that's a little bit on the why it is just so difficult. It's in part about the levers of the state and why it's so much easier to get these little small pots here and there that then all add up. It's much easier to get those approved than it is the very, very big reform agenda, as we've seen by Labour's U-turn on the PIP reform. It's really, really hard to get support behind doing those really big systems changes. Helen, I'll come to you for some more on any of those questions.
I'll sort of give some thoughts which I think pick up on the points that all of you made. A bit so I'm Natasha. I guess one of the things that I've encountered quite a lot in the work I've been doing in this area is how the system, how people get kind of turned into victims. And it starts pretty early on, and people, whether it's with a disability, with neurodiversity, being told that they're disabled, that they can't do things. I mean, Lana, as you talked about it, basically you're sort of being put in a box almost, and your horizons being limited. And I've been talking to people about what's going on with the explosion of people coming forward for sort of mental health support in schools and in education, and support with neurodiversity. And as part of that, young people being told pretty much at school, okay, so you've got a ADHD, autism diagnosis, even if it's on the sort of lower, less severe end of that spectrum. So here's how you're going to get benefits when you leave school. I mean, those sort of conversations happening. So I think something is going very wrong pretty early on, and people being steered in the wrong direction towards being told that they can't do things rather than being in what they can do. The other thing, and Caroline's a bit more on your point about tackling it as well, though, and the point is sort of incentives, is so I'm thinking about, well, how do we change the sickness benefit system that clearly isn't working? People are making a rational decision that they're struggling to work. They've been told that they have a disability. Oh, and here's a route to getting financial support through the benefit system rather than through work. So you clearly have to look at, well, how do you change that system so that when people come looking for support, the support they get is not cash, which means that they're more likely to stay at home and worry about losing that cash, but what is the support that instead steers them towards being able to have an income of their own and actually make their way up the rungs of the ladder that Fraser was talking about. And I think that is some quite substantial thinking, which is the stuff that I'm spending time looking at while we're in opposition, because to what Caroline was just making about it being really hard to do welfare reform. I think one of the things that the government has really fallen, struggling with, is they turned up in government thinking that the civil servants would just have a sort of a here's what you need to do to fix welfare. And it's not to criticise civil servants, but I was working with them when I was a minister before, and I know they didn't have a blueprint of this is what you need to do. It's just the Tories didn't do it. It's that blueprint isn't there, and you've got to do the hard work in opposition when you have, despite me describing how busy at times, you actually do have some more bandwidth to do that work. And also, you're going to have to win the mandate to say not all of this is going to be easy. Some of these changes, particularly when you first have set them out, then people might say, hold on, that's is that you'll get challenged. But actually, you've got to make the argument that this is the right thing to do for the country, and I think the time to do that is to win the argument in opposition.
Lana, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Natasha, you are, we know what it's like when you're put in a box that you don't want. When I was given my diagnosis, my choices were go weave baskets or operate a switchboard, and I said neither. Thank you very much. I had plans, and to your point about what do we do about how do we redraw that eligibility, and it's to do with, and this is what I've been talking about an awful lot, is in my mind, and this goes to disability and sickness benefits in particular, not universal credit, and I'm slightly deviating, but when it comes to disability and sickness benefits, there are people who have such severe learning physical difficulties that they will never, ever, ever be economically active, and to those we owe a decent living, and they are the ones who are living the most miserable existence at the moment. They are subject to the minimum income guarantee. It's horrible. It's actually horrible. And then there's the middle part, and that would be, Natasha and myself, there's a diagnosis, but we have aspirations. We don't want to be put in a box. We want to be given the support that doesn't infantilize us, but it actually gives us the tools and the ability to get on, get a job, look after ourselves, look after our families, contribute to our communities, and actually, go on holiday, own a home, all of those things that we all really wanted to have, but because we get put in the wrong box with the wrong label, those options are closed off to us. And there's the third group that actually just really need help through the health service. With ADHD, with anxiety, with depression, with addiction, those are not people who should be on lifelong, assistance for their difficulties. They should have help otherwise, because it's positively the worst thing you can do to somebody who's suffering with depression is tell them, stay at home, don't work, don't engage, and just don't be part of it. It's the worst thing, and it's the worst, waste of life, waste of potential, and waste of contribution that you could possibly have. And why are we so weak? It's because every time anybody, and I had such high hopes for Liz, and what she tried to do, because it ends up being a spreadsheet exercise rather than actually a lived experience exercise on what are we trying to achieve. And then secondly, when you try to take something away with all of these benefits that Caroline has mentioned, when you try to take any of them away, you get the Merlin situation. Oh my word, it's unforgivable that, you're trying to, destroy lives, drown kittens and whatever else we do. And it's not fair, and it's not right, and it puts people like Tasha and myself, it puts us in an awful situation, and millions of other people in this country. It's a waste. It's such a waste, and we have to get on top of this. And I'm so grateful to Helen, for all the work, and Caroline and Fraser, for what you do, because this needs to be talked about. We have to have a rational, sensible conversation about where we're going, what we're doing, and how this country is treating its own people.
Brilliant. Time is rapidly marching on, so I'll just take a couple more questions, and then I'll come to you, Fraser, for any more thoughts on any of the questions. So, gentleman at the back, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt here. Gentleman at the back first.
Congratulations on the report. Everyone here, I suppose, is interested in politics, but this issue of, we used to talk about benefits grounded, but you're talking about something really very, very different. When would you say that was? Because I remember hosting a social innovation thing when I was at KPMG before Ian Duncan Smith became the local pension secretary. Is universal credit the source of the problem? And is the conglomeration of unintended consequences? Because we're going to unpack it, we're going to have to get to the source of the problem. And it just feels relatively new. I don't think we were talking about this 15 years ago, to be honest.
Brilliant. And gentleman over here.
You've all spoken about hard choices, but isn't the electorate the group which finds it hardest to make hard choices? The reason all these reforms have failed is because they aren't very popular with activist groups or the electorate itself. And so, do you really have a people problem rather than a politician problem?
Brilliant. So there's one really about, is universal credit the problem? And then the second question is, are the electorate the problem? So lots to dig into there. Fraser, any thoughts from you? And then I'll turn quickly to 30-second wrap-ups from the other two.
Both great questions. You're right. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith did quite a lot right. There was this great, when he started doing universal credit, we had the kind of the jobs miracle. Every single time employment figures came out, there were more than the OBR had forecast. He'd done a lot of work in opposition for the Centre for Social Justice. They come up with these reports, and it was all going great. And in fact, the day before lockdown, we actually had the highest proportion of Brits employed than at any point in the history of these islands. It was really quite amazing. And that should give us confidence the government can reform this, because we've done it before. And we had the same with Frank Field's report, with James Purnell's report of the Labour government. They were bringing down incapacity benefit from 2002 onwards, steady. They were priding themselves on the number of disabled women, people categorised as disabled like Natasha, who were in work. And right, so they're saying, look, let's not have this, you can work, you can't work. Let's reframe the economy. Now, what went wrong? And I'll tell you, in my opinion, the mental health diagnosis, that surged worldwide. So this started to come actually pre-COVID, when you look at this, and it's very difficult to diagnose. I mean, if you've come in saying physically unable to work, sure, a doctor can say yes or no. But if you say, I'm too anxious to work, I'm depressed, I've got psychological disorders, they're a lot harder to diagnose. So what you then see is a number of people given disability benefits because of psychological reasons or mental health reasons absolutely surge. And that happened throughout COVID. And what happened was, in my view, when the government cleared themselves up after COVID and dusted themselves down, this had surged ahead and they couldn't quite work out how to stop it, because you've got the sick note system, which is not fit for purpose. You've got the way that the wrong idea, in my view, of treating mental illness as being a binary, yes, you're fit for work and no, you're not, combined with our particular welfare system to give a problem seen by no other country in the world. Every country in the world is seeing antidepressants diagnosed quite a lot. Every other country in the world is seeing that mental health becoming, as a burden of illness, a far bigger factor, but no other country is seeing sickness benefits surging anything like we've got. So by that time, IDS has gone. This was his reforms were about taking people from worklessness and unemployment into work. They weren't really about sickness benefits. This is about sickness benefits. Now, sir, you're talking about the voters there. This is one of the, of course, it's very difficult to win this. This is the most difficult task in politics. Who is really going to win votes saying, I'm going to go over and cut benefits? There are going to be people thinking, look, my niece, my nephew are on this, they're going to be vulnerable. You should be protecting them, of course. The language you use is very important. And I think because we haven't discussed it, we haven't really come up with a language. It's been taboo, really, until recently, which is why I'm so pleased to see Helen now join the battle here in a way that you couldn't, obviously, when you were part of the government that was making the problem in the first place. But but it's good. We're at least we're having the debate, and that debate matters a lot. You can't really talk about skivers or scroungers or shirkers or in any way demonise or demoralise the people. It's the incentives that's the problem. But you also know that if you do welfare reform, it's the toughest job in politics, because if something goes wrong, and look what a massive machine it is, it will go wrong. So you're going to get people like Chrissy Hunt, like Philippa Day, like Jodie Whiting. These are people who are basically, you're going to get people for whom it goes wrong, and you could lead to suicides. A coroner could argue that that suicide was messed up. These are going to be very difficult kind of I, Daniel Blake moments. And it's difficult to do massive reform if it's not going to go wrong for at least a small number of these guys. And when it goes wrong for a small number of the most vulnerable people in society, that creates a massive, big political headache. And it says to the politician that the political risk lies in reforming. If you reform this and you get it right, then maybe in 10 years' time when you've retired, people might thank you for doing it. People don't thank Ian Duncan Smith right now, not really. But getting it right, there is no political capital to be gained. But attempts to get it right, and there's so much can go wrong. So the asymmetric political risks are absolutely huge. And we saw with the kind of Clinton-Gingrich reforms in America that it does need to be bipartisan. There needs to be a kind of political amnesty where the two parties will not attack each other for doing reform, because it's very difficult to do. So that is why. And I don't really remember a welfare reform agenda being put to the parties at the last election, for example. Even now, if you look at reform, they're talking in rather disparaging terms about Alarm Clock Britain and the skivers and the scroungers. You know, I wouldn't vote for that. You cannot. So I think we need a more advanced vocabulary, and from that a better public debate, and from that more realistic choices. And evenings like tonight are part of beginning to improve the public debate.
Brilliant. Helen, any 30-second reflections from you before we wrap up?
I guess on the political question, I hear phrases you saying there should be a political amnesty.
For reform, you would bank the government that they'd reform, wouldn't you?
I'm realistic that I don't think political amnesties tend to happen. I think, very, very occasionally. But what I do think is about the importance of making the argument on this. And I guess what the one thing is actually, I think the public debate is shifting on this, and people know that our benefit spending is out of control. And I think there is a mood from people more to see savings, even though Craig Fraser, you're absolutely right about what about so and so, what about so and so, which is a problem that comes up or would come up. But I do think in terms of making the argument, like we are getting to a point where economically as a country we have no choice. Like we cannot continue the way we are continuing as an economy. We cannot continue with such a huge number of people who are not contributing to the economy, whether it's the cost of benefits or actually that they're not contributing, that they're not playing their part. Our country needs, look at the world in which we're living, look at the countries that are growing stronger. We live in a dangerous world. We all know what's, the wars are Ukraine and the Middle East and the growing power of other parts of the world. So I feel we're at a point where we just have to have a very frank conversation that we don't have a choice, we can't continue as we are, and also, and this is part of the political thing, to say, and it would be better. I mean, move to the hope, not just to sell it, but because genuinely our country will be better and people's lives will be better if we get this right.
Brilliant. And Lana, any final 30-second reflections from you?
Countdown, right? This is precisely why I set up the Welfare Information Network, because we need to start having better conversations. Ian Duncan Smith set up universal credit, and the underlying principle is, make work pay. And with this report, I think it's obvious that we actually need to allow work to pay, because at the moment we're not. With all of these hidden benefits sitting in the background, we're not seeing the whole picture. And that's what I'm hoping to tackle, because we need better conversations. Natasha needs a better conversation about this. People who are, in that bottom 25% need a better conversation, because we need better outcomes. Not for them personally, not just for them personally, but actually for the country.
Brilliant. Well, we could have talked about this all night, but I'm afraid we're out of time. We will get kicked out if we go on much longer. Firstly, thank you so much to my panellists for being here tonight. I know it's a very busy world out there, and you've had a lot on today. I know you have in particular, Helen. So thank you for coming along. Thank you to all of you for being here at